I live and work in Sooke, and I'm a mom and a grandma and a student. I'm going to Royal Roads University, taking a master's in economic development and communications, and that forms the basis of a lot of my work, contract work. I own a business doing marketing and communications, and spend a lot of time on political campaigns, apparently.
It's a funny question, but where do you come from?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Winnipeg. I lived in Winnipeg most of my life until I was in my early 40s, and then I moved to Golden, BC first, and decided I didn't want to do winter again, so I thought I'd try out Powell River, so I ended up in Powell River for a little while. And then my daughter agreed to move to BC, so we decided we wanted to go back to university, and so we landed in Nanaimo, where I ended up going to Vancouver Island University and taking a business degree there.
And what brought you to Sooke?
Actually, I was back in Manitoba working on a research project with the Southern Chiefs organization on child welfare. And Songhees Nation reached out to say, we have an executive director role. Are you interested? And my daughters were still here. So I said, heck yeah, I'm still interested, or I'm interested rather. And it just worked out that they were able to get me back onto the island. And I worked for them for about a year. And I tried to buy a house on the reserve, but unfortunately the bank wouldn't give me a mortgage because it was leased land. So then I started looking for a home, and I came out to Sooke, and I just really fell in love with Sooke and the small town vibe here, but there's still lots of amazing things happening, all the festivals and events. So really tried to put down some roots here in Sooke since I've been here.
You mentioned the small town vibe, and you came from Winnipeg. At heart, are you a big city gal or a small town gal?
A little of both, I would say. I like the amenities of a big city, but I like the intimate feel of a small town vibe where everybody says hi to each other and knows everybody. And in fact, I just came from the Artisan's Garden where I was meeting and greeting everybody. But, I was impressed by how many people I actually knew in person. So I love both. I think it's great. Yeah.
Now, you've got an extensive background in Indigenous governance. Where does that come from? How did that start?
Yeah, I think there was a natural progression from Indigenous child welfare. I worked in First Nations child protection for several years, and then I wanted to make a career change. It's really tough, and I really raised my hands to child protection folks who work in CFS and foster parents. But I wanted to be part of building something, nation rebuilding. And so I went back to university, as I mentioned, at Vancouver Island University, and took a business degree. And then it just kind of morphed into working with some of the political organizations, first in communications, and then became the director of ops for the Manitoba NDP. And then I think people saw that I was politically astute and aware, like very aware of what's happening in the community, and have strong opinions and a voice. And so it's just kind of been this natural progression to remain in politics and governance. So, and I continue to work on reconciliation efforts as part of my volunteer work with the 60 Scoop, and I formed a nonprofit organization for survivors of Indigenous child welfare and continue to do some of that work. So again, just all kind of worked together, and that's how I ended up here.
You mentioned the 60 Scoop, and incredibly, there still are people who don't really know what that is. So in a couple of sentences, which is almost impossible to do, I know, can you just explain what the 60 Scoop is and what your attraction or draw to working with it is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, back in the 50s, after World War II, there was a movement towards improving human rights. And in Canada, they did do some of that with amendments to the Indian Act. However, what happened was the federal government gave jurisdiction to the provinces, and they decided that they were going to take care of the Indian problem, and they did. They, went on reserve, and in some cases off reserve, and scooped entire families of children and placed them in non-Indigenous homes, with the idea that they would make them good Canadian citizens, mostly in Christian white Christian homes. And so there was an entire generation of children stolen from their biological families. And so I was one of them. I was actually adopted from my Indigenous family and placed in a non-Indigenous home in Winnipeg. And I was fortunate. I had a really good foundation. My parents were both in education, and so books and school was always really important. And I played sports, and I had a good home life, but many people didn't. And so when I started hearing some of the stories of other people that had been through that adoption process, it really triggered something in me to use the foundation that I was given to speak up and continue to try to bring more awareness to it. And so formed the organization, as I mentioned, and at one point I ended up at the United Nations, where I spoke on an international level. So I'm not really sure how that happened exactly, but I've continued to advocate for more awareness and more healing for adoptees and folks who have been through the child welfare system.
I think my hesitation is I feel like you've got to walk carefully around this experience of somebody's. What is it from your experience and your knowledge of that you feel you bring to all the work that you do now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think working in child protection, but also having some of that lived experience, has given me a trauma-informed lens to be able to sit down with people, hear them, and have them feel like they're being heard. And I think that's where we were missing some of that from our elected leadership. And so it got to a point where I was advocating with our chiefs, with our MPs and our MLAs to say, no, we need to do a bit more awareness around this. Fortunately, I was working with the former Senator Murray Sinclair, excuse me, in advocating for a national inquiry. We still don't know how many children were taken. We still don't know where they were taken to. Lots of us have never met our biological siblings and parents. Some are long gone, unfortunately. So there's still some healing work that needs to happen. And like I said, I'm happy to use that foundation that I was given to do some of those advocacy pieces.
You mentioned your parents and playing sports, and they were teachers and so on. What kind of kid were you?
I would definitely say I was a precocious child. My poor parents, I feel bad for them now, but I had many irons in the fire all the time. I played sports. I played ringette for many, many years. And then, as an adult, I played hockey. And then, I was very involved in the community, with friends and neighbors and those kind of things, probably getting into things I shouldn't have as a teenager. Unfortunately, I did get into some trouble as a teenager, mostly running away, no legal trouble, but running away from home. I was really struggling with identity once I hit adolescence, and so I kind of went a little bit berserk in my teen years. But I became a mom at a young age, so I had to straighten out and get my act together. So she was a gift in that sense.
In many ways, I'm sure. When did you always know you were adopted? Did you always know what your roots were?
I always knew I was adopted. My parents were very open about that, and I always knew I was Indigenous. They said I was Métis, but the narrative that I got was that my bio mother was Native from northern Manitoba, and that my father wasn't in the picture. Well, when I actually did get some information about my birth story, it was completely opposite. It was my mother was white. She was from Thunder Bay, and she was 23. She wasn't a teenager, and already had a son, and so felt that she couldn't support another baby. And so, like I said, once I started getting a bit more information, some of these stories unraveled. So I was able to track down some of my biological siblings and get a bit more history about what really happened. And so, again, I feel like there's some stigma around adoption and shame, I would say, for birth moms in particular, but parents, fathers as well. So I really try to work around that and to bring a bit more awareness that no, lots of these moms were coerced, both by the government and the churches. The churches played a big role in that. historically, and now is a time to do some reconciliation. Let's talk about it. And you mentioned, stepping lightly around it. I don't feel that. I feel like we need to talk about it more. We need to give this some more light, and let's work through it together.
You have an interesting perspective on motherhood as a result of this. What kind of mom are you?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I've tried to be a supportive mom. I've tried to be the opposite of some of the things my parents did because religion played a big role in my childhood. I felt that, I wanted to let my children have the choice of religious freedom, freedom to be who they are, freedom to choose a number of their own path. I guess that would be the way to think about it. And I was strict but fair, I would say. Like, I had high expectations of my kids and myself, and just tried to be there for them. And I think it's paid off. I have good relationships with my kids, even though they're autonomous now and mostly grown, but they still feel comfortable talking to me, and that was my goal.
And what kind of grandma are you?
I am definitely the fun grandma. They come to my house and it's fun time. We go to the park and we have pizza for supper and we'll watch a movie and that kind of thing. So I am more of the fun grandma. Unfortunately for my daughter, she doesn't appreciate that so much sometimes, but yeah.
She'll be like that when she's a grandma.
Yeah, I think so. I hope that I've laid that groundwork for her to be that fun grandma too.
When you did mention that you went through some troubled times as a teenager. A lot of teenagers do, but how much do you think your personal story was influencing that sense of trying to figure out who you were? Because kids go through that anyway, but there's an added dimension there.
There is definitely an added dimension for me. I was the only one of 3 children who were adopted who was Indigenous. My brothers were non-Indigenous, and some of the names that they called me were not very kind. And so I internalized a lot of that. There was a lot of confusion around identity. I knew I was Indigenous, but I wasn't really being encouraged to explore that. And so when I got to adolescence, that's when I met other Indigenous students and kids my age, and then I was like, oh, okay, this feels a bit more comfortable. I feel a bit more at home here. So I spent a lot of time with other kids that were Indigenous, and then I was able to feel a bit more like myself. And so I think it played a big part of going through some of the identity crisis that I did, and really trying to search out, who am I, where do I belong? I still feel some of that, like, where do I belong? I don't really feel like I belong anywhere. Sooke is probably the longest I've lived anywhere in the last 25 years, so really trying to put down some roots here, get to know people, and yeah, just feel like I belong.
It's interesting to me because what you're talking about is what constitutes home. And that to me is very interesting in somebody running for council. So for you, what does constitute home?
Yeah, I think it's feeling accepted and feeling that you do belong somewhere, and at least being welcomed. Maybe you don't necessarily feel like you belong, but at least you're being invited to join the conversation, to be part of the community, to have a voice. And so that's really what I've tried to create in my circle. Certainly for my children, I've done that, or tried to do that as best I can. I may not agree with their decisions sometimes, and that still happens in the community. I don't always agree with some of the decisions that our governments make, but being respectful and having solutions. Okay, so, I don't necessarily agree with this bill, but how can we make it better? How can we look at solutions around some of the problems that we're having? So,
where does that come from, that quest for solutions? Not everybody has it.
Yeah, I've always been curious about how the world works, I think, and questioning things, much to my parents' disagreement, dislike. They did nurture some of that, I think, certainly through education. So I've done quite a bit of that. All my life is just asking, like, okay, why is that? How did we arrive at that decision? What was the rationale? Trying to have a better understanding. I've always kind of thought that way. And then when I got into more politics and governance, okay, so what is a viable solution that fits for everybody, not just certain interest groups or in this case, say for example, in Sooke developers, what is their motivation? Looking at those kind of pieces, and so, making decisions that are balanced and benefit everyone. Always have that equity lens for sure.
That's a very deliberate, thoughtful and deliberate approach. Do you have a knee-jerk response to anything?
Yes, sometimes I do. I think, oh man, that was really dumb. And then I, again, just think back, okay, so what was the rationale behind that decision? I have made a deliberate attempt not to have those reactions necessarily, but there are times when I think, like, that was not very equitable or not very smart. Like some of our federal policies, I think, oh, that's backwards. So how can I use my voice to raise awareness to this? And some of it's social media, some of it's in communications, but yeah, just trying to have a solutions-based approach as opposed to, venting. I think, you can do both.
You've mentioned developers, and I think it's fair to say that's probably at the root of most of the issues that people talk about in Sooke at the moment is what kind of development should be happening. Without going into all the policy stuff, what's your general philosophy towards development?
Sustainable development. Right now, we do not have enough infrastructure to support these mega projects. I think if we're looking at road work, for example, okay, so if we're going to build another 200 unit building, how are we going to improve the transportation system? One way is by transit, strengthening our transit system. I've talked about it many times at council and in the news. So if we're going to have this type of development, we need to have the matching infrastructure. So I think we need a steady growth plan. If we're going to, we can slow down growth a little bit through zoning and variance and those kind of pieces, but then looking at the matching infrastructure. And so that's kind of what I look at. And then certainly from a climate perspective, having homes that are solar ready and having energy efficient heat pumps, for example, and having those policies in place now makes more sense than trying to retrofit. So for me, it's those types of sustainability measures that we really need to implement.
Where did you develop your philosophies around growth and development?
I've definitely been speaking with many people here in Sooke, and I think there's some fear around becoming like Langford. And it's no disrespect to Langford, but they've had massive growth, and I think the fear is that we'll become like that the growth will be sprawling and unchecked. So definitely speaking to folks in and around Sooke has been helpful. But also, I've lived in other places, and I've done a lot of travel and seen, how they've been able to manage some of that sprawl and making sure that we're being responsible with growth. And
with events down south, the world has changed even since January, and there's at best uneven economic policy being applied from the States, and there seems to be some consideration around the world that means some realigning economically, and nobody really knows what's going to happen with the economy, but it's not inconceivable that we will be looking at a somewhat different economy. You're certainly not the the rate of growth that we've had. For you, what does that mean in terms of looking at how Sooke grows and looks forward?
Well, I think there's things we could be doing right now to support our local businesses. Strengthening that commercial base is one of them. We have very little commercial space here in Sooke, and so creating that opportunity for local entrepreneurs is really critical at this stage. There are some unknowns, but I think that taking the time to listen to business owners is really important. I don't know if you were part of the task force last year about the traffic situation that was happening on Charters Road, and then coming up with some really good recommendations around how we're going to address that for business. So the Economic Development Committee that's in place now is a really good start, but I think we could be doing more to listen to the business community and engaging with them about how we're going to combat some of this unknown, the tariffs. Certainly the tourism plan that's in place right now is great. However, we don't know what's going to happen with the United States, and they're our biggest opportunity for tourism. So how can we take measures now to mitigate any kind of risk or strengthen that plan? So
what's the one trait in a politician, it can be a politician anywhere, any level, that you admire, that you think that's what I want in a politician?
One of them, there's a couple. I would say two for sure. One of them is the ability to listen and John Horgan was really great, and I've had a number of really great mentors in my life, including Wab Canoe and John Horgan, and in some cases, folks that I've watched we don't necessarily align, but they're really good at listening to people and making them feel heard and taking action if they can. So I think that's one piece, but the other piece is to pivot, to be able to say, you know what, I didn't get this right, or I made a snap decision, I've rethought this. So being able to say that, to say, I didn't get this right, but let's go back and fix it together. So for me, those two pieces are really, really important.
How would you describe yourself? If there's a flood, are you the person out there with the sandbags, or are you the person in the strategic command saying where the sandbags should go?
Probably, I would say both. I would say at first I would be in the strategic planning part, and then I'd be like, no, I need to get out there and start sandbagging and helping my neighbors. I think both is true of me. I tend to be more of a planner, and then be like, okay, now we've got a plan, let's move into action. So
the word community gets thrown around a lot by all sorts of people, both as a marketing premise and as an excuse or an explanation of what's good or bad in the world. What does community actually mean to you?
Well, when you look at the root of community, unity is part of that. And so for me, that is the biggest piece, is how can we come together on common goals? Not everybody has the same method of getting there, but I think we all have common goals. We want healthy, happy families. We want a safe, affordable home, clean drinking water, all of those kind of basic needs, and then a sense of belonging, as we talked about earlier, and those kind of pieces. So that has been me, I would say, over the last, since my adult life, I would say about myself is that I've done as much as I can to do that in the places that I've lived and worked, is to make people feel that they belong, that they have a space, a safe space to be. So for me, that's what community means, and just coming together. That was part of the plan for the solstice dinners, is just to get together, have a meal together. Let's just break bread together and talk, informally. We don't necessarily have to have an agenda or a goal for a dinner. Let's just meet.
We live in some very divided times. When you come across somebody who has opinions that are very different from your own, how do you approach those conversations?
There's a couple of ways. I would say if they're not harmful, if they're not being harmful, I will listen and I will think about it and be respectful, of course. If they are being harmful, I will say something. I will say that that's not appropriate or whatever the case might be. If it's racist or discriminatory, I will say something. And that's been my philosophy, I guess, over the last, well, my whole adult life really is injustice and doing what I can to make the world a more equitable place. And so I'm not afraid to speak up when I feel I need to, but for the most part, people are pretty respectful here in Sooke and in the broader community. So, I just try to listen and let people feel heard.
It's going to seem like an odd question, but one of the great common denominators is music. What kind of music do you like?
Yeah, oh man. If you saw my playlist, I have a healthy attachment, or maybe it's unhealthy, I don't know, to 80s hard rock. Lots of Motley Crue, lots of Ozzy Osbourne. My kids would tell you, some old school hard rock is always great. I do like other types of music, but that tends to be where I have most of my song list.
Where does that come from?
Actually, as a teenager, I got my first job when I was 15. I worked in the office at Leon's Furniture, and I spent most of my money on concerts. I went to as many concerts as I could. I went to Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, Motley Crue. I went to all of them. Aerosmith, some of the older ones, and that's what I spent all my money on. So that's nostalgia for me. I put my headphones on and I go for my walk, and that's what I'm listening to is all the hard rock from the 80s.
So do you have a favorite?
Motley Crue is definitely my favorite. Yes, absolutely. I'm embarrassed to say that, but it is true. That's what you'll find on my playlist most.
Well, keep on rocking on.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.